This session of Keen on Architecture, Draw Along with Watercolor is going to be on the Affleck house in Michigan. The Affleck house is a Usonian home by Frank Lloyd Wright. You see it in this L-shaped plan here. And Usonia is a progressive methodology by Wright after the Great Depression. So he had accomplished the likes of the Martin House, which we drew earlier, and one of his internationally acclaimed homes, the Roby House, with the fantastic corner view of the projecting planes in space, of very well-heeled clients, very expensive homes, sort of all one-offs and sort of prairie-sized castles, if you will, at the time. The Depression doesn't allow for that in Wright's career, so he has to adapt his abilities to try to figure out how to keep his firm open. So he establishes this idea of Usonia. And Usonia are simply taking the language of a prairie home and trying to eliminate costs on site. So one of the biggest ways to eliminate costs is to reduce the size of the buildings. So now they're small scale homes from 1,200 to maybe 2,000 square feet. They're without basements now. So it's all slab on grade. It's without pitched roofs. They're all flat roof for the most part. Some have singular pitches over major spaces, but the idea of having pitched roofs everywhere is gone now. The wall section is minimized. All the idea was that to condense and create what the minimum amount is available to the typical American family rather than sort of the well-heeled entrepreneur. So to remove himself from that, he forms the idea of Usonia, which is sort of an acronym for the United States of North America, because he sort of believed with James Duff's law that we, the United States, in justice to Canadians and Mexicans, have no right to use the title Americans. So Wright started to refer to America as Usonia, which is sort of the preferred form, all of us being Usonians and our nation of combined states named Usonia. His first home for that, from just after the Great Depression, is the Jacobs One house. And we see that also is an L shape, and that's in Madison, Wisconsin. And that was built for $5,000. So all the different types of construction techniques were analyzed by Wright and tried to minimize on the site, so to reduce labor, reduce material, and still provide that sort of quality lifestyle of indoor-outdoor relationship to nature. So the Affleck house is a similar type of L-shaped plan, but it's on a more extraordinary site. So it cascades down into a little stream here we see in the lower right. And so we'll look for this as more of a three-dimensional play of planes in space, much like his prairie language, but stripped down to the essence of the modernistic prose of those planes themselves. So we'll look deeper into the idea of the Usonia as we draw along here. So one thing I would mention about our view shed is we're going to rotate this, because typically the Usonians had their front aspect to the building that faces the street, and then the back, which opens up more to the volume of nature associated with it. So our view here is going to be from this side, looking towards the cantilevered patio space off the living room and down into the cascading valley with the stream in it to the right. So this is our view shed of sort of walking into a modernist sculpture, why Wright again is considered the first of the four modern masters, to think of architecture as an abstract ideal of how we live in space and volume. It wasn't about the plan or the elevation, it was about moving through volume. So we'll come back to this in a little bit in model form, but I thought I'd also step back into what might help some of the users here and what type of product you bought for your watercolors. Sometimes it's hard to actually see what color you're going to receive on the paper as you mix out from the pads here or from circular types aspects, or even if you bought tubes of colors. So what some people like to do is create a matrix. So there's sort of two ways to do this. If you simply said you bought a box of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 colors, then do a little box of each color straight from that pad and do the same thing up here, so those 12 colors march up this way. And that way you can see immediately if you took this blue with this green, you end up with this bluish green color here. So immediately you've got a reference point. If you want to get to that color quicker and it's not coming directly out of your tab, you can mix those two together. So it kind of gives you a memory of how your 12 colors immediately becomes 144 in terms of all the blends that can happen. And then obviously there's a tertiary way to do it to say, what happens if you mix this one, and this one, and that would expand your color chart as well. So that's one method to kind of see in advance and have a historic record of what these mean to you when you start to sketch with watercolors. Another way to do it is simply take each pad out, and this is from a set called Ackerman that I have. And so I took the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 browns I had selected, another array of 6 browns, sort of the reds and yellows here, the greens and blues, and simply did an opaque wash and then more transparent wash with the same color. So that's just one color with more water-based. So you can see you actually almost create a secondary color from the original color by using less pigment and more water. And that's the power of watercolor, to use transparency to, again, double or triple what you have in your standard stock that's coming right from the tube or from the little pad of paints, and then see what it's like when water takes over, becomes a little more diaphanous that way. So you might want to do one of those charts when you have time to fully understand what you're working with coming out of your box. Okay, so in this case, with the Affleck here, it's down to cypress siding and brick walls in the composition. So we can go back to sort of an off red brick and mix that up right away here like we did before. And we'll, once we kind of establish what we think we like here in the pond with either red, orange, back to the more terracotta. And then we start to cut that with the water. We'll get a pretty extensive pool of brick tone over here. Now, once we establish that color, we also want to take it back to our blank sheet and trialing that to see what that color looks like on the paper stack. So that seems like it's a cooler red. And so I'll proceed with that as a base. And so when it dries, it'll be the sunlit brick. Then we'll use our shadowing from the sky, the blues, to deepen it up and show shade side, and then the cast shadows on top of that brick. So our brick patterns are sort of support pieces for the wooden frame up above, again, reducing costs and kind of making the whole skin brick, which is more expensive than a wood siding. We have a brick wall here and a brick wall at the base here that supports the deck up above. So this will be simply with our range of water over here to cloak this whole zone with this first wash of brick red. It's a big area, so I use the larger size chisel brush. And now we'll go underneath the deck. And this one's a little bit amorphic at the base because the green we'll use eventually to support this will cover the brick. So it doesn't matter really how we end this here, because nature's going to come up and infill that space for us. Okay, and that's all the brick that we're going to work with today. And so now we want to go to the cypress, and the cypress is probably stained to kind of approximate the brick, but it's going to bleach out whiter over time. So we're going to come into that, add some water, and add a little bit brighter tone of the red-orange to it. And then maybe some brown as well. And again, we'll test this out. So it's a bit more of a honey red than the red brick. So testing this out on the side over here, you can see it's a little bit warmer, a little oranger red for the siding for the rest of the home. So I'll start with that also. Oops, kind of washed over my wash there. Clean that up real quick. A lot of extra water in here in the pad to make sure it's going to flow across all the spaces I need it. There we go. And now I think we're ready to wash the rest of the spaces. So all the rest of the volumes we're going to look at, the planes in space, are going to receive this coat. They don't have the actual planking, which will probably line in later and do a little bit of the brushwork as well. But this is sort of a simple, quick way of just rooming the entire home. This will project out and be in shade against the bright trees behind it. This is the outside skin of the major public space inside the building. We see the sign over here. So it's two-story space coming down the stairs towards that main living space, which projects out and makes this relationship of man and nature. And we'll have a play of light between the shade shadow and sun side of all the woodwork. This is actually open through, so eventually we'll have the green that'll go around this once this sets up and dries, and then we'll cast shadow from the home on the green, so it'll set on a plane as it steps down toward that little valley. And then that wood carries up all the way over here up to the windows. Both upstairs and downstairs. And then to the edge of the last window up here, there's siding adjacent to that, and that'll be towards our end of our sketch. And now there is a cantilevered decking up here, which floats above and lets light come down periodically. So as the sun moves across, it casts light and shade patterns on the skin. So the whole transfer of the light by the sun on the space animates the building over time. So we're going to go to the underside first of that. This is a wood member, so it's the same tone, the same stained citrus. And there's the facing for it. And then we'll see little glimpses of light beyond it. We see the front panes of these. And now this is fenestration, so between these we'll simply drop down some tone for the value of those bracketed windows. Okay, there's one more little bit of brick here beside on the lower level here, so I'll come back to our original kind of reddish wash. Pull that in here by the lower set of stairs that take you back up to the main level. And these will be poured out of concrete, and they're stained to be a red, but they've been washed out over the years. So when the sun hits them, they'll be very brilliant. And the faces will go dark. So we'll start with them the same as the wall, but we'll make them darker with our value later. And that kind of sets up the overall base wash for the whole building so far. Now we're going to flip over to get our background base of the greens. So we'll study that in another pool over here. And now mixing with clear water. You don't want to go to the red to the green just yet. You'll blend in a little bit later, but with pure clear water, go to sort of a warm green first. And then maybe a forest green second to it. Forest green has got more blue in it. And you may have a pad which is actually blue-green too. So blend those together. And then keep adding water and maybe drop a little of the red of the building into the green now. Because the red and green together will create a brown eventually if you keep working them both into each other. And then we have to make that fairly sloppy and wet because we have to cover a lot of ground in the background of the building that's kind of creeping underneath it. So make sure you have enough pigment in there. And then we'll simply keep adding splashes of water so there's enough to cover our area. Now this would be a very big zone, and we kind of want to shape it in the form of the trees around the site, but not as if they're the subject matter themselves, because they're definitely all in the background. Okay, so I think since it's such a big area, we'll come back in and do the structure form later. We're simply going to put in the wash of area of the global aspects of the branches of the trees around that. And this would be in full summer growth, so it'll be dominant compared to the structure that supports them. And when that dries, we'll come back in and show the structure of those elements carrying those in the forest. Now we can move this out of the way so we can draw these in. And now we're going to simply sort of do a cartoon image of those trees in terms of how we'd like to set them against the building. So we want to have that dark kind of adjacent to the edge and then break apart toward the top here a little bit. And we'll have it run right to that corner so we can make that darker with blue. And leave some white space so the sky pops through, and then come down again. You want to always edge your buildings with the value of nature next to it. So you're using nature to really create that distance between those corners in the background. Now we're taking that down around to this point. And then dropping down between the two projections here, one for the roof line and one for the actual decking. Then it seems to open up with sky more and be less forested over to the right. So we're going to eliminate it so it's not just one wall of green. We're going to have it become more segregated over here on the right end. So we'll come up and let it dissipate a bit as we move away from the house proper. And this is where sort of the main trunks of the trees and their foliage kind of breaks, and beneath them are the trunks that are going to carry it. So down here, we see more shrubbery and bushes, which are coming down the arc of a hill. So back at this point, right about here, is where the underside of the home starts to cascade down. So that's a key mark for us to say that's the end of the property that drops down further. So we're going to work in simply the bottom of the forest, so to speak, as a whole plane in the distance back there from that point on. And that'll carry all the way across here, sort of in a linear fashion as a backdrop, holding the trees above it. So that's kind of the distance of eye height back here. So in a sense, this is a vertical throw in front of us, and this is a horizontal push, sort of like the bottom of the forest, which is moving away from us. And so we'll use certain value to articulate that. And it becomes very bright here by a horizon line. You can see the horizon line is sort of right in the middle of the balcony here, as these two lines are projecting down to a point. You don't see much of a left vanishing point. It's almost like a 1-point perspective here. All the lines are rushing down toward that one point of the horizon line. And the horizon is going to be right about here underneath the base of the home proper. So we'll let this edge, as you make it darker later, actually poke out against the white of the sky. And then right in the foreground here at the base, we can use our, move this out of the way really quick. We could use our pointed to come in with more prominent greenery, which is planted right here by this base walk. So coming down the stair takes you around here and then down underside. But right here, there's a little bit of a planted garden adjacent to the structure. And so that'll be the start, sort of our foreground we'll use to kind of build up that base. So that's sort of a placeholder for now, but it gives us a reference point of scale. So why this sets up, I'll speak a little bit more about the language of the building. It's again, this sort of natural amphitheater where when the house comes to the edge of the ravine, and this model doesn't show the hill coming down, so this sits on a hill where you come down from this edge towards the house proper, and the hill kind of falls off this way. So these are actually extended deeper than this model has built them out to be on this end. So as it steps down, the whole house then opens up and becomes this picture view towards why we're on this site and why Wright worked with Affleck on this particular area to say it's all about the forest and the stream down below. So it's almost like a miniaturized version of falling water where you hear the movement of the water as part of your experience in the living space. So the living dining space is cantilevered over that small stream. It's like an amphitheater with a sloping lot right down to it, and it's this sculptural piece out of brick and cypress, which is a landmark piece of the modern movement of triaxial design. X, Y, and Z plane are all important. Okay, so now we'll look at, we'll start to mix up our blues. So that we develop that shadowing or shading device. So working from your pads that might be ultramarine or phthalo blue or blue-green even. Just build up that base of value. And then we'll try it. If it's too powerful and too opaque, we'll just cut it with water. If it's too strong of a blue, you can cut it with some of the value you've already used in the sketch, which will mute it out a bit. You can tamp it down with a little bit of black and make it more of a gray blue. And now we'll just sort of liquefy it so it moves across as a sort of a transparent in our first go. This is like using the 30% in a marker set or a real light value in the pencil set of draw along videos. So you want a transparent wash here as we do wet on dry. And make sure you have enough because this has to cover the whole building in certain areas. And that looks pretty good there. And so one of the first ones we can see right in front of us here is we're going to use our cast shadows first as our reference. So actually we'll back up and we'll do our value for the shade side first. So the way this is working is the sun's coming from the right and it's lighting up the brick wall here and the planes that are perpendicular to the right, which means the face of the building here is actually in shade because the sun's probably earlier in the morning moving to the west. And so this is still in shade side. So we're going to take all of this space, anything that faces us directly becomes a plane of blue that keeps it in shade. So we're simply going to wash what we've done so far. Into our blue here. I'm going to run right over here because that faces a blue. The underside does. And this will be very dark because it's actually in shadow as well, but we'll give it a coat of blue to start with because this is completely underneath the building. That side faces it, the underside there. So everything we're looking at that's perpendicular to us right now as the viewer gets that cloak. And then this edge of this brick wall, which is the barrier of the stair moving from the lower level up to the living space. That one that faces us. And then because it's completely under the sun, the underside of the cantilever up here is also in shade. So that's our first setup to kind of allocate. Oh, there's one more shade area here. The edge of this wooden turnaround. There we go. So the next, once this sets up, is we're going to go deeper with the value and we're going to show the angles of the sun that cut into the space. So it's coming down and projecting from this corner down onto the brick wall here, coming through the cantilevered top roof element and projecting lines onto the skin there. And we want to pick up those key values. So we need that to set up first because if we went in there now and tried to do that angle up here where this was still wet, it would bleed out and go back into that. But right here, we've got two zones that can pick up that extra zone of darkness. So we'll come back in and heavy up that shadow a little bit more than the shade side was. And you'll see once we make this darker than the shade, how it starts to read like we're making the sun get to work on our site here. Just go right to that line that I had drawn in for you to show that having that projection of cast shadow come down into space. Now over on the right here, you can pick up your pencil, or if you want to use ink now too, you have to wait a little bit longer for it to dry. At that second window, there's another parallel line to this coming from the sun that comes over and down, that comes all the way down to the stairs. And it has a certain thickness to it, as that is this corner piece creating a shadow. So that strikes down, and we can fill that up with our shadow blue. And as I mentioned before, these are stained concrete pour stairs here. So they'll be bleached white by the sun coming directly on the top of them there, but the faces of them will be in shade. So we're going to have those go darker as well. And now, because this is projecting a mix of light and shade and shadow coming through these open aspects up here that are sometimes creating shade and some kind letting light in at various times of the year as that cantilever comes out, there's more light bouncing around and coming to this outside corner of this plane, and there's less coming back in this opposite end. So this square, the lower left over here is darkest, the upper right is lighter. So we can come into that far left corner and simply go heavier with the blue right there and wash that out, our edge. As we simply just push that water around. And then it'll find a home as it works into the rest of the water and gives that patina for that wall there. Because obviously all the wood's got its own definition of fibers and activity within the wood, which you don't see as a mass from the distance, but it'll read in the water of having more character because the water works with the paper now and gives you this type of profile. So this little outpost that pops up here comes down and drops the shadow onto this plane. Right about to that point. And then the whole inset of this window frame here, and we'll draft this out, give us a nice crisp edge, will come to about a third of the way down the window. And so this being set beneath this wall inset a little bit, there's a cast shadow just by the architecture itself onto the frame. Like that. And while we're here, it's probably a good starter color anyway, just to use the blue black that you started. And simply give a primary coat for the fenestration we've established so far. So again, go to your blue black, test it to make sure it's within the family of ideas you got going so far. If it's too opaque, just cut it with water, because we can work lighter to dark. We can't work darker to light. So don't be too aggressive in the beginning. You'll be using more dry washes on dry later on as we kind of build up the latter part of the sketch. Okay, so we're going to come into this corner here, probably with the mid-range brush. And we'll show these windows. Let's see, maybe I will use the smaller brush. These windows actually, these are glazed, and these are glazed as well as screened, because this is the big kind of three-dimensional space where you move from the upper deck of bedrooms up this area and come down a great kind of 2.5-story space, which then connects to the living area. And then we'll complete the windows that are opaque down here. These are getting kind of a quick reflection from and now that the blues are out there and kind of established some of our zones of value across the way here, we're going to come back into the vegetation, because again, it's not a direct subject matter for us, but we're going to move some of the the shadowing blue, black, gray over here into some of the reds and the greens we've used and create kind of the patina we want for the bark of the trees in the background and give some sense of structure for them. So you want to look for something that's going to be darker and bark-like. You might want to have a little more brown in it. But again, it's going to be transparent as a wash in the background because it is a secondary subject for us. So I think that'll work for us now. And we're going to come back in and make it very light and thin, a very sort of wet wash. So it's very innocuous in the beginning, and we can always add depth to it later. So again, looking at nature herself and how they work, the trunks are going to get larger as they spring up from the bottom. So it's deeper at the base. And that thickness is there. And it cuts through then towards the top and thins out a little bit, and then it starts to splay. You start to see some trunks spring up through the forest over there. And then there's one in the distance behind it that's probably the same scale tree, but it's further away. And so this just sort of assigns placeholders for what's going to come in a little bit with more value back there. But again, thicker at the base and it gets more delicate. Sometimes it gets cut by the vegetation around it, so you don't see the entire trunk of the tree. Come down. You can always then accentuate certain parts of all the trunks with more value. And that just shows light, shade, and shadow moving across those three-dimensional forms. Then it comes up to the sky, and it becomes differentiated in little pieces here. You might even want to move to a finer point to get that kind of detail, or just take some of the water off the tip of your brush and just use more of the paint to get something finer line right up here. It kind of moves up into the sky. And again, this is again kind of a cartoon version of the tree, but it's working from what nature's showing you in the photograph. Got a little information here. And it just kind of springs out lightly and starts to give some definition to the subject matter back there. And you can do it a little or you can do it a lot. You can get lost, but be careful not to make it a subject because there's no architecture to compete with the qualities of a tree. So we're trying to step that down a bit in terms of the interest level and have the focus remain on the home proper. And we'll do one more over here toward the edge. A little opaque there with that one. And then maybe take some of that into the green wash, and we'll kind of edge our deck over here with a nice dark, so that it's got something to play off on that corner. That'll hold that in space, and then we'll come down here in this lower zone with some of our blue shadowing. And now we'll find that this lower place is going to have a nice deep tone cast by the house proper, because this whole upper deck now is casting a shadow down beneath the home. It'll help sit that down. And then maybe as we try to figure out the final composition, we probably want to articulate a little bit more in the foreground to the right here so that we know that it sits within an upper terrace of the forest over here that's actually closer to the house. And so we won't see the bottom strut of this brick down here because of the foliage that comes up to the little pad of concrete and stonework here in the foreground. And now, as I mentioned, because this is woodwork in shade, this is actually brickwork that's in shadow down there because this is throwing absolute, cutting it out completely. So we have to go much deeper on that shadow down below because that's doing a lot of the work and supporting the building. So when it goes dark, it'll seem like it's carrying that load. So we come right to the base of this. There is a little bit of here, but we're going to come right up to the base there. And it'll be deepest and darkest right where it meets the underside of the house, and then it'll sort of wash out lighter as it comes down to the forest because then light bounces around and eventually achieves that connection. So we can start with more pigment up here and then go back to the water and just sort of wash it down with a wet brush. So you can move pigment just by having water in the brush too. So it's going to be darkest right where it supports the house and then come back down to the color brick as light bounces around and enhances us seeing that. And we'll come to the underside over here, which is the same kind of principle. It's not receiving the light, so that's going to be one of the darkest darks for us. For that plane. We'll do the same thing for the corner of the plane, which is closest to us. We'll put a lot of pigment right here because that's the same condition here, so it's going to seem more prominent. So we'll put a lot of value right on that corner and then have that dissipate back to connect to the home. One shot up. And so now our planes are kind of working in space here. We'll maybe do a little conditioning out at the base of the forest because we always have some residual inks in our ponds over here. So kind of a blend of some of the colors used already. We can give some definition, sort of like the ground plane down here, to show there's a lower canopy of activity here at the base of the forest. So just to animate that a little bit. Because it's a different language than the tree trunks of the trees. And then perhaps there might be some shadowing from the forest on the forest itself. So there might be a whole zone back in here, which will have a horizontal throw of the canopy of a tree. And the exact same thing happens a little further away. So now we create a distance going back of that. And so we'll take a horizontal and run it through the forest. And now we'll come back into our principle that once we get the glazing, even though if you can't see it from where you're on-site sketching or from a photograph, we'll come back in and find those lines anyway. So inside this space, there's going to be some canopy of an interior roof line, ceiling line inside, which would be a different plane than the wall. So now we have a ceiling and wall. Down here, it's kind of really close to the horizon. You won't be able to see it, but obviously above the stair hall here, you just continue that line back. So we've got ceiling and wall here, and those are the only interiors we see. So our goal is to just pick one of the two and say you have to assign one of those planes darker, and then all of a sudden you've got 3 dimensions through your glazing inside the space. So go back to your dark blue black wash again. And we'll say that the ceiling is brighter in this case because it's mostly wood trim in there. Even the walls a little bit darker. So if the ceiling goes lighter here as well, seeing through these panels here would make those darker. So that gives you sort of a sense of moving into that space above us. And we can have a little bit of cast shadow for the mullions for these elements, just because they're closer to us. And now I think we can, before we do our final wash here to kind of end the drawing, I think we're going to go to our pen and now show some of the striation, the linear quality of these panels that move through the space. Because right now it looks like it's a flush concrete block. Now we have to indicate that language. So really easily done is, obviously you're only gonna do this on a dry section. This is still setting up, that's setting up, and we can work over here too. First thing, we're gonna come over here and try to count. There might be 7 or 8 pieces of cypress siding there, so you want to kind of scale that appropriately. And then give that indication again, not the entire line, but the idea of the movement of light across those panels here. In this case, we're really close to the horizon lines. They're not really vanishing much. And then we'll edge them a little bit darker right as they create space beyond them. And then the same type of line work is seen here. And now this is such a dark piece down there, and it's brickwork, so the detail will be much finer. It probably doesn't need the attention of that line work. But obviously this does. It's very important. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That line going back, and make sure this is definitely going back to that vanishing point. Take you all the way back there. And that'll help give some texture and quality of what the architecture is like there. Because we're so close to the brickwork here, we may have to do some at least to start, maybe at the corners of it. And then turning and coming back this way, right through the light and the shadow. Just to get a feel of it. And make sure you're working with that horizon line. Then we'll turn the corner on these two. And maybe edge this a little bit with a little stronger line. So just doubling up that line will help that form hold that space as it moves back in the house there. This one floats above it. It really creates a lot of space there. And when we double up these black lines, we're not actually seeing the black lines. We're seeing one plane meet another and creating that. So our last bit of wash, we go back into our dark blue black again with some red mixed in. We're going to come right to these black lines and kind of stroke it stronger there, because that shadow will appear darker when it meets the light behind it. Then we come up here, we can show a little bit of detail. These pieces is how they're built up here. The house off the backdrop a little bit. And then I think everything is set up and kind of dry. We'll come back into some of these lines now and go one last time a little bit deeper, just with the fine point. So again, mixing in a light wet wash of blues and blacks. So even in a loss of light and loss of color, it still is of color in this media, which gives it a richness beyond just the black and white media we've done to date. And test it on your paper stock. And now we'll deal with this closer to us first, because the more powerful contrasts will be the ones that are in the foreground. Right at the top here, the deeper that gets, the less we see the line we just did in ink. And this piece is more important to us. Really close, really defines the space behind it. So we'll push that value right to that corner. Let that sit. Push it to this corner, which is just above it and casting down great shadows on the side of the building. And we don't want to take that value all the way over here, because really the center third of the drawing is really our subject, and this is just sort of dissipating off to the right and off to the left. Round me down here again to really set that dark strut for the home beneath down here. Then I'll pull it off its background too, so it floats in the language there. And now we can come back into maybe a couple of the windows that are more dominant in terms of being able to see into their space. So we'll come to the ones that are close to the outside. And use that rolling through there. And then maybe because the stair is always a great way to get the eye to move through a space, we'll come back to these kick plates and treads and make them a little bit deeper, so they're contrast with the white of the sun lighting up the treads themselves. The eye naturally then wants to go up and then carry to the light, the dark, the light, the dark, the dark, the light, the gray, to the light again, is the way we're going to move the eye through the sketch and have that keep coming. So I think we could do a little bit up here to turn the corner against the sky, right at this edge, because that is on the shade side. Hold that edge a little bit. And I think we'll wash this down just a hair, because it's not as bright as the rest of the building. There we go. And I'll take the dark out to this corner. That piece, the cap for the building. And now we'll work a little bit into the forest and we'll just about be done. So within the shroud of this, the green seems like it's one tone, so it reads like a two-dimensional plane, even though it holds some form. So now if we come in with our blue-black wash again, and again, fairly watery to start with, you can build it up over time as time allows. We're simply going to create some shape, because the trees are always casting dark values onto the other trees. And so we'll go horizontally through this and build kind of a terrace of higher and lower zones of value in the forest. right down to the edge here. Because even though this is in shade, we want to pull it off the back. So having that go a little bit darker right where it meets, or that ridge will help pull this deck off for us. And I think it'll go darker one more time with the cast shadow down there. As you see, when you squint and look at the photograph of it, that's one of the blackest blacks down there between the pier that sets up the balcony up above and the cast shadow below. That's our last little source of reference for a nice deep dark tone in there. We're going to come and simply do that closer to the edge because it seems darkest when it contrasts with the forces being lit and distance to it. If you did it all the same tone coming here, it'll seem like a vertical wall. We want it to read horizontally there. So maybe even hit that twice. So you got lots of pigment at that point. And I'm gonna do the same underneath here where it's receiving the least amount of light. And then we'll draw it down with water if it's too opaque. Use just the water in the brush and float it down. You can kind of direct the flow of the pigment. It'll follow wherever the water is leading them. And so that's a nice dark to kind of set things down in there. Our last little bit now is our foreground to show some of the definition, because if they indeed are the closest to us, then we have to be able to see more information there. So we'll simply give a little bit of structure to the plant life there, and then let them cast shadow on themselves in this foreground. And that should hold that fine. And I think we did a little bit over here as well at the base, just to deepen that up a little bit. And that should hold those down. The Affleck house in 1937. And just recently, down in Florida Southern, which Wright built in the 40s, a Usonian home was always planned for that site and never built. So they finally worked with Wright's plans for that, and just recently finished the latest Usonian from Wright, as Wright still, having been buried in 1959, has still been building off his archive of his works, mostly in the United States, sometimes around the world. So this is the latest Wright home to be built from the Usonian epic down at Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida.